Mr. President, I've been coming down to the floor now for several weeks to talk about the need to restrain spending and to cut our deficit. And as we look at the next few days, we're going to have an opportunity to debate something that does that. We're going to be talking about the cut, cap, and balance plan. The third part of this plan, the balanced budget amendment, something I've supported since I first ran for the House of Representatives about 15 years ago. This past week, though, I received a letter from a Boy Scout in South Dakota who was writing in to earn a merit badge. And I'd like to read an excerpt from that letter. This is what he said, Mr. President, and I quote, "I feel that the federal government needs a balanced budget. If we don't, the debt gets larger each year. I feel that there are two solutions for this. In our house, we are careful to only spend what my mom and dad earn. The needs come first, and what is left is for wants. Many times we were told no when we asked for something. With my allowance and lawn mowing money, I divide it between donations, saving, and spending. I can't spend more than I make," end quote. And I think there are two very powerful things in this statement, Mr. President. The first is that the need for a balanced budget is obvious, even to this young man, because like him, we cannot spend more than we make. The second is that this has a profound impact on the younger generation. The debts that we're running up now will have profound impacts on our children and our grandchildren. I have the senator from New Hampshire is on the floor today, and she is someone who is fairly new to the Senate, but has already had an immediate impact on many of these budget and spending debates. And she is also the mother of two young children, each of whom is carrying a $46,000 debt. And I would just ask the senator from New Hampshire about those two young children and the $46,000 burden that has been placed on them by this $14.3 trillion national debt that we have. Do you feel comfortable having your children owning essentially $46,000 of this massive national debt that we've accumulated now for the past several years?
Well, I thank my colleague from South Dakota. This is such an important issue. As you pointed out, as your constituent has written you, as the mother of two children, I'm deeply concerned with what is going to happen to the next generation if we continue to kick this can down the road, and if we don't use common sense to balance our budget. You know, it's funny, when you go back home, you hear from people, I know I've heard from my constituents in New Hampshire, I'm sure you hear the same in South Dakota, that basically only in Washington would the notion of balancing your budget be called extreme or something else. I mean, it's common sense that you can't spend more money than you have, and I think that we need to make sure that we pass this cut, cap, and balance plan, because it's a common sense plan for how we could raise the debt ceiling and ensure that we don't continue along this cycle of continuing to increase our credit and not have a plan to pay our bills. And borrowing money from China, that's got to stop. When you think about all the money we've borrowed from a country like China that doesn't share our values, well, this cut, cap, and balance plan is, right now, there is no other plan that has been presented. It was just passed by the House of Representatives on a bipartisan basis, and we could do this now and put ourselves on a path to a balanced budget and make sure that your constituent, I know that you're a father as well, that our children don't bear the burden of our failure to make the real decisions today and to continue to kick this can down the road. We owe it not only to everyone in our generation, but to our children and our grandchildren. I wanted to ask the senator from South Dakota, the cut, cap, and balance plan puts an emphasis on cutting spending instead of raising taxes to bring down our deficits and our $14 trillion debt. Do you believe that's the right approach for America?
Well, absolutely. And I would say to my colleague from New Hampshire that the cut, cap, and balance approach is the correct way to approach this problem because it focuses on spending. It makes cuts to spending today, real cuts this year to this year's budget. It caps spending in the near term, and then it puts in place a balanced budget amendment that would require Congress to balance its budget in the future years. Now, obviously, that's something that many states have. My state of South Dakota has that. I know that the Live Free or Die state of New Hampshire has had some very distinct views and direct views about the role of government in making government's role limited and keeping spending under control, living within your means. And this cut, cap, and balance approach to that, in my view, is the correct approach, because it does put the emphasis on getting spending under control. And if you look at the 5 times that our country's balanced the budget, since 1969, the average amount that we spent was just under 18.7% of our GDP, in other words, of our entire economy. This year, we're set to spend 24.3% of our GDP. That's just on the federal government. And historic highs. If you look at the president's budget, he spends substantially above this average for every year in his budget. You literally have to go back to the end of World War II to find a time when we spent this amount as a percentage of our GDP on the federal government. Now, part of the reason for this is the huge increase that we've seen in non-defense discretionary spending between 2008 and 2010. In fact, in those 2 years in which the economy was hurting and families everywhere were having to cut back, these accounts increased by a mind-boggling 24%. Now, this year, part of our deficit is also caused by low tax receipts, which are caused by a slow economic recovery. But if you look at the tax revenue that we brought in 2006 and 2007, we brought in over 18% of GDP in both years. So if we're able to constrain spending, we know that we'll be able to balance our budget once our economy improves. And I would argue that one of the ways that we help our economy improve and get back on track is to get federal spending under control. 2006 and 2007, the income tax code, the way that we collect taxes, was very similar to what we have today. We brought in over 18% of GDP in both of those years. So when we get back to a more normal, I think, footing in terms of the economy, we will see revenues start to come back, but we've got to get spending controlled and actually start to rein in the out-of-control spending that we're seeing here in Washington, D.C. If there's still a gap, even if we get back to 18% of GDP in terms of what we collect in the form of tax receipts, there's still 23, 24, 25% of GDP that the President wants to be comprised of federal spending. The gap cannot be met through tax increases. It's going to have to be dealt with through spending restraint. Now, a couple of years ago, and I want to get back to my colleague from New Hampshire in just a moment, but I want to, her predecessor in this job, Senator Gregg from New Hampshire, who was a great fiscal mind around here, somebody who was very focused on spending and debt, he and Congressman Ryan asked the Congressional Budget Office to estimate how high tax rates would have to rise to pay for our projected spending. CBO's response had 2 parts. First, they said that marginal rates would have to more than double to cover the expected expenditures of our government. They said, and I quote, "The tax rate for the lowest tax bracket would have to be increased from 10% to 25%. The tax rate on incomes in the current 25% bracket would have to be increased to 63%. And the tax rate of the highest bracket would have to be raised from 35% to 88%. The top corporate income tax rate would also increase from 35% to 88%. That's end quote. That's according to the Congressional Budget Office in response to an inquiry from Senator Gregg and Congressman Ryan about what tax rates would have to do in order to get our budget back into balance. Now, the other thing that the CBO also said, that practically speaking, this is impossible. You cannot increase tax rates and create this huge disincentive that would have a profound impact on our economy and our ability to create jobs. And so we know that amount of revenue would never be collected when you raise tax rates that high. We know that the real way to deal with the budget and to get spending, or to get the budget balanced and under control in this country, is to get spending under control. And so the cut, cap, and balance approach is something that I think is the correct way in which to proceed, because it puts that focus on spending. We need to make sure we constrain spending. We need to make sure that we begin living within our means. The cut, cap, and balance approach does that. And by the way, I want to make one observation about that, because there's been there are people who've said, well, the balanced budget amendment that's been proposed by the Republicans is too draconian, it won't work. What the cut, cap, and balance plan says, it doesn't specify or prescribe a specific balanced budget amendment. It says a balanced budget amendment. And I think that my colleagues on this side would be more than happy to work with our colleagues on the other side to come up with a balanced budget amendment that actually would work, that would ensure that we don't spend more than we take in each and every year, which is what almost every state in the country has in their constitution, and that's why they're able to live within their means. Now, I would say to my colleague from New Hampshire, you recently held, I'm told, a town hall meeting back in New Hampshire, and I'm interested in knowing what your constituents had to say, because I think New Hampshire has always been a good barometer when it comes to fiscal issues. What do they think about this crisis that we're facing, and do they believe that the way that we ought to deal with this would be to constrain spending and to get our budget balanced in that way, as opposed to moving toward raising taxes, which is what many of our colleagues on the Democrat side and the President have suggested doing?
Well, I thank you. What I've certainly heard from my constituents in New Hampshire, we do have a requirement that we balance our budget. And it's not easy to make those tough choices, but that is what I've heard from my constituents. They don't understand why in Washington there is controversy over the notion of balancing your budget, because at home people are balancing their budget, families balance their budget, businesses balance their budgets. I meet with business people and they just look at me in disbelief when they say, I don't understand why in Washington they don't look at what you have to spend and base what you're going to do in Washington based on what money you have. It really comes down to common sense. And one of the biggest issues I've heard from my constituents that they're concerned about is that it's been almost over 2 years, over 800 days since we passed a budget in the United States Senate. And the notion that we've been operating without a budget and running well over $1 trillion deficits and haven't sat down and done the hard work of rolling up our sleeves, allowing the Budget Committee to do its work, I think people are astounded by that in New Hampshire, because they understand that if you don't have a basic blueprint for our country on how we're going to spend money, the end result is what we've gotten, is continuing to run up deficits, continuing to spend money that we don't have, continuing to borrow from countries like China that don't share our values. And one of the things that is very important about this cut, cap, and balance plan is that it cuts $111 billion in fiscal year 2012, and it places firm caps on future spending, contingent upon the House and Senate passing a balanced budget amendment, which is so important, as we've talked about, to let's let the states decide. I mean, really, this is about sending it to the people of this country and allowing them to say whether or not we should balance our budget. I know what the answer will be in New Hampshire. They will say, yes, please balance the budget. This also, if you look at where we are with, as you've mentioned, with respect to spending in terms of the size of our economy, we're over 24% of our GDP that we are spending right now, well above our historical level, well above the amount of money that we're bringing in, and yet the only fiscal plan that the president brought forward would massively increase our debt over the next decade, so much so that not even one person, one member of his own party in the United States Senate would vote for that budget. And so when we talk about real plan to get America back on track, this cut, cap, and balance has a very common sense approach. We will cut spending right away, put together a responsible fiscal plan for America, then make sure that we have those caps in place so that we don't continue to spend close to 25% of our economy, knowing that this is well beyond. I mean, the president has increased our debt 35% since he has been in office. And then finally, let's put to the states the question of whether they think it makes sense to balance our budget, because I think we know what the answer will be there, that they will say, yes, please balance your budget like we have to do at home, like we do in state government. The other issue that we're facing right now is, of course, what the rating agencies have said about our failure to handle this fiscal crisis. We've heard about the concerns that if we do not come up with a credible plan that really cuts spending right now, that we have our ratings threatened, that this will further impact our economy, and that's why we can't continue to put this decision off. And this cut, cap, and balance right now will put forward $6 trillion of cuts over the next decade that will make sure that we preserve our credit ratings for this country. We'll make sure that we focus on economic growth to get people back to work, because if we raise taxes the way that CBO has suggested based on the questions from Senator Gregg and Congressman Ryan, we know that that's going to hurt the American taxpayer. It's going to hurt our job creators in this country. I also happen to come from a small business family, and I know that the impact on raising taxes in the way that was described, if we had to raise taxes to address the spending problem we have in Washington, it is going to hurt our small businesses who create the jobs in this country, and that's the last thing we should be doing when we have over a 9% unemployment rate. So I hope that my colleagues will pass this cut, cap, and balance plan right away. The House has passed it, and we can raise the debt ceiling with a responsible plan to cut spending right away, spending caps, and a balanced budget amendment going to the states. I would ask my colleague from South Dakota, when you were first elected, before you served in the Senate, I know that you had a career in the House of Representatives and served the people of South Dakota there. There was a vote on the balanced budget amendment at the time in the Senate, and it only failed by one vote. What do you believe our current fiscal situation would be had the balanced budget amendment passed the Senate at that time?
Well, you know, what's remarkable about that is when I first got here, and there was a vote in the United States Senate in 1997. We didn't have the opportunity to vote on it in the House of Representatives, although I think we could have passed it with a 2/3 majority there at the time, because it failed in the Senate by one vote. It got 66 votes in the United States Senate. It needed 67, and I can't help but think how different things would be today had we passed the balanced budget amendment then, sent it to the states. I presume, as you do, and I'm sure New Hampshire is not unlike South Dakota, would certainly ratify it. You need 38 states to ratify it, but it would have put us on a path that is fiscally sustainable. And ironically, at that time, the debt was about $5 trillion. We're talking about $14 trillion today. $5 trillion is what it was back then. So that's a $9 trillion increase. If we'd had a balanced budget amendment, we wouldn't have run up this debt. Now, it's interesting because I would point out to my colleague from New Hampshire, too, that if you go back 29 years ago this week, President Reagan led a rally of people, thousands of people on the Capitol, calling for a balanced budget amendment. And he said, and I quote, "Crisis is a much abused word today, but can we deny that we face a crisis?" End quote. Well, I would say to my colleague from New Hampshire that the federal debt at that time was $1 trillion. And President Reagan thought that was a crisis at that time. And obviously we're in a situation now where the debt is 14 times that amount, $14 trillion, since President Reagan 29 years ago suggested that we needed a balanced budget amendment because of the debt crisis that we faced then. Now, a lot of our Democrat colleagues say that we just need to balance our budget. We don't need a balanced budget amendment. My response to them is, as the senator from New Hampshire has pointed out, where's your plan? We've been sitting here now for 812 days since the Democrats passed a budget in the Senate, and even then, that was a budget that didn't balance. The president's budget that he submitted earlier this year, as the senator from New Hampshire has pointed out, was rejected by the Senate 97-0. When the president sent a budget up here, it was actually voted on in the Senate. It didn't get a single vote in the United States Senate, either Democrat or Republican. So the president took a mulligan on that budget, gave a speech outlining a framework for how he'd cut the deficit. That didn't balance either. So it's clear that the Democrats don't have the will to balance the budget now. But if we had a balanced budget amendment, they would, along with all of us, Republicans and Democrats have all contributed to where we are today, but they would be required to balance the budget every single year, and that would have a huge impact on what our future is going to look like and what the future for your two children and my two children is going to be. Now, the rating agencies are considering, as the Senator from New Hampshire mentioned, downgrading us if we don't take concrete steps to reduce our deficits. It would have a tremendous impact on interest rates if that happened. Now, as I mentioned earlier today, the 3-year government bond interest rates for Portugal are 19.4%, for Greece 28.9%, and for Ireland 12.9%. And we are already suffering from slower economic growth because of our debt and deficits. There's a study by economists Reinhardt and Rogoff that found that debt levels above 90% of GDP were associated with economic growth that was 1 percentage point less than it would be otherwise. And we know from the President's own economic advisors that that translates into the loss of about 1 million jobs every year. And so it's clear that we need to cut spending now. We need to balance our budget. We need a discipline imposed on Congress. A balanced budget amendment would do that like it has done for so many states around the country. But the cut, cap, and balance approach, cutting spending, as the Senator from New Hampshire mentioned now, today, by over $100 billion this year, cutting spending over the next decade by almost $6 trillion, and then putting in place a balanced budget amendment that would ensure that going forward into the future that we learn to live within our means, that we don't continue to spend money that we don't have. And so I appreciate the observations of my colleague from New Hampshire. As I said, you represent a state that has a great tradition when it comes to keeping spending and government under control. We need that tradition here in Washington, D.C., and I would simply say to my colleague from New Hampshire, I hope that we can find the support among our colleagues here in the United States Senate when we have this vote, and it sounds like now it's going to be scheduled for sometime on Saturday, to get a big bipartisan vote in support of cut, cap, and balance. I know that that's what my colleague from New Hampshire hopes as well, because I do believe it is the pathway that will get us toward fiscal sustainability for the future of this country and put us on a trajectory that is good for our children and grandchildren, doesn't put this nation on the verge of bankruptcy, doesn't have the adverse economic impacts that we're experiencing in real time, both in terms of jobs lost, potential for much higher interest rates that would affect homeowners, people who are trying to get student loans, auto loans, people who are trying to start businesses. It would be absolutely devastating to this economy if that happened. If we don't get our fiscal house in order, that is the train wreck that we are headed for.
I thank my colleague from South Dakota, and I too hope that we will have bipartisan support for this cut, cap, and balance plan. It is so critical, and as the President's own fiscal commission said, our challenge is clear and inescapable. America cannot be great if we go broke. Our businesses will not be able to grow and create jobs, and our workers will not be able to compete successfully for the jobs for the future without a plan to get this crushing debt burden off our backs. Well, this cut, cap, and balance plan will help get this crushing debt burdens off our backs to allow our job creators to get out there, our small businesses, to create jobs. Also, when you think about starting from where we began this discussion, our children, we have to act now. And I will tell you, I don't want my two children looking at me and saying, Mom, what did you do about this crisis that we saw and was so foreseeable that we could do something about right here, now, in the United States Senate to address? If we can come together around this cut, cap, and balance plan, and once and for all, let's commit to passing a balanced budget amendment. Let's send that question to the states. Let's let the people of this country weigh in, because we know they will weigh in with common sense, because they do it at the state level, they do it at a family level, they do it in their small businesses. So I too hope that we will work with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, that we will get this cut, cap, and balance plan passed. And I look forward to working with all the senators in this chamber, and particularly the senator from South Dakota, who I know has been such an advocate and such a strong fiscal conservative, wanting to preserve our country and the greatness of America, to make sure that we get this plan passed now. Thank you.
Well, I think our colleagues in the House have shown us the way. They passed this last night. They've given us an opportunity now to have this vote, and it's long overdue. And the problem, at least in my view, and I think the numbers bear this out, this is not a revenue problem. This is not a problem of having too little tax revenue. This is not a problem, as I pointed out, that can be solved by tax increases, which would devastate the job creators in this economy and make it more difficult for our economy to recover and to get people back to work. But this is really about spending. This is about getting federal spending back to a level that is historically normal. And if we can do that, we will have done a great, I think, thing for the future of this country, for our children and grandchildren. And it is so important, in my view, that we not wait any longer. We can't afford to wait. The time is now, and we're going to have this vote coming up here, it looks like probably on Saturday. And I hope that we will have a big bipartisan vote in support of this approach that would cut spending today, cap it in the future, and get a balanced budget amendment on the books. Mr. President, I yield back the balance of our time.